Good evening and welcome. I'm Reverend Molly Vetter. It's my privilege to be the senior pastor here at Westwood United Methodist Church, the home of the Claremont School of Theology. And it is a special joy for our two communities to co-host this evening tonight, which is the 47th annual Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. I'll trust that other people on the agenda will say more of those formalities. I've been assigned a moment of centering. My own call to ministry took place while I was a student at Boston University, active in Marsh Chapel, where Howard Thurman was dean years before I was there. His portrait hung in the room where I had a lot of formative conversations, and it was a fairly stern look on his face, and often still in my life when I need to be reminded to do the right thing, the just thing, the courageous thing, I picture his look giving me an admonition. He was, of course, an important teacher and mentor to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his spiritual life continues to be a blessing to me. So as we begin, as a way of centering ourselves, I wanted to read aloud again a prayer from Howard Thurman that has been a gift to me over the years. So I encourage you to take in a deep breath. As you breathe in and exhale, we pray together. Open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weakness. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me tenderness for my toughness. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me. Amen.
Such a joy to welcome you to this 47th annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. This is the first live lecture we've had since 2019, if you can believe it. We haven't been able to be live. It's all been by Zoom. And to be here the first time at Westwood UMC, our new home. Holding the event here in the heart of Los Angeles is such an important milestone for us. I want to acknowledge Bishop Charles Wesley Jordan and his wife Margaret, whom Bishop Jordan served as our bishop in residence at CST for many, many years. And only in retirement did we allow him to escape us on this. But this drive would have been pretty hard, Charles, so we're glad that you were able to finish up at the Claremont site. As we battle the hypermasculinity, racism, and cruel retribution of the Trump administration, we surely miss the prophetic witness of Martin Luther King Jr., who would have led us all against what Trump is soullessly trying to inflict on the world. It's absolutely imperative that we keep Dr. King's values in the forefront of our current fight. Those values include love, justice, honor, and nonviolence, the antithesis of what Trump stands for. It is critical for us to hear the words of our guest speaker, Dr. Charity Chandler-Cole, and many others who speak the truth in love. Now is the time we must find the courage to stand up, make that witness prophetically against the cruelty of the Trump administration. And finally, as Molly had mentioned, I would be remiss if I did not remember our own Reverend James Lawson Jr., whom we lost last year. His successor is here, and we're so grateful that he's giving such great leadership to our home in United Methodist Church. Jim was the embodiment of Dr. King's values, and like Dr. King, we miss him more than ever right now. I'm sure that the two of them look down in dismay at our current situation, even as they experience the total love and joy of God's spiritual world. So let me close today with a quote from Dr. King, which I looked for diligently, but was provided serendipitously by a friend, Dr. Larry High. King said, "Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism." Thank you all for being here today as the fight of love and justice continues.
Good evening. I am here to bring the occasion as to why we are here. Each year around this time, Claremont School of Theology presents a series of events to honor the life and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The King Celebration at CST brings together faculty, staff, students, community leaders, activists, and pastors to discuss the significance of the ministry of Martin Luther King Jr. to the African American community, to diverse religious communities, and also to the nation and the world. Here at CST, the practice of observing MLK Day, it dates back to 1978, 8 years before the National Day of Observance was put in place in 1986. During the early years, the lecture was listed as the King Convocation on the school's academic calendar. However, in 1993, the event became the Martin Luther King Jr. Endowed Lectureship, established with a gift from Dr. David Bruce Rogers, son of Professor Cornish Rogers and his wife, Elsie Rogers. Tonight, we remember and reinvigorate the dialogue that was started by Preston M. Williams, who was the first lecturer and was the professor of theology and contemporary change at Harvard Divinity School and editor-at-large of the Christian Century. CST has engaged in that dialogue with wise and inspirational conversation partners who span the spectrum of activists, community leaders, scholars, and prophetic preachers. Some of these include the Reverend James Lawson, C. Eric Lincoln, Renita Weems, Emil Towns, Dolores Williams, Marsha Riggs, Dwight Hopkins, Anthony Penn, Karen Baker Fletcher, Monica A. Coleman, Brian Bantam, Phyllis Isabella Shepard, Aubrey M. Hendricks, Courtney V. Buggs, and this year, Charity Chandler-Cole. Come on, somebody, say amen. Tonight, we gather in sacred expectation as we welcome Dr. Charity Chandler-Cole, who comes to help us remember, reclaim, and reawaken the radical dream of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know if you know, but we are living in trembling times, times when the cries of the suffering are not whispered, they are screamed. From the Sudan to Ukraine, from Israel to Gaza, from the streets of distant nations to the sidewalks of our own neighborhoods. Blood still cries out from the ground, and too many leaders have learned how to talk about peace without ever walking in justice. We are watching a nation wrestle with an epidemic of gunfire, addiction to cruelty, and a devotion to division. We are staring at a world where lies dress up like truth, where propaganda preaches louder than conscience, and disinformation disciples more people than love ever seems to reach. We are being pressured to forget that diversity is divine, that equity is ethical, that inclusion is incarnational, and we are watching the legacy of Dr. King get remixed, reduced, and rewritten. A prophet being turned into a postcard, a revolutionary turned into a quote machine, a justice fighter turned into a mascot for comfort. But the real king did not just dream, he disrupted. He didn't just speak, he sacrificed. He didn't just hope, he stood in the fire of truth until justice caught flame. So at the dawn of this new year, of 2026, we refuse despair as our destiny. We choose hope as our holy work. We commit ourselves to the sacred search for truth in our homes, for courage in our churches, for conscience in our classrooms, for visions in our theological spaces, including this very ground, Claremont School of Theology. I don't know about you, but I'm looking for answers. I'm reaching for direction. I am chasing glimmers of grace in a darkened world, because as long as God is still speaking, justice is still possible. Hope is still holy, and the dream is still alive. To all of you who have gathered here this evening, I say on behalf of Pan-African Seminaries Association and all the student organizations and the entire CST community, we appreciate your presence, and we thank you for being here, for choosing to join in the conversation, and for your participation in the 47th Annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebrations.
And now it is my honor to introduce our esteemed speaker for this evening. Dr. Charity Chandler-Cole is a justice alchemist. Look up the word alchemist. Fusing lived experience, visionary leadership, and radical truth-telling to reimagine systems built to harm. A nationally recognized advocate, strategist, and changemaker born and raised in South Central Los Angeles. She's a local. Dr. Charity has dedicated her life to transforming the systems that have historically failed children, families, and communities. With a powerful blend of lived expertise and executive leadership, she has emerged as one of the foremost voices in child welfare, youth justice, and systemic change. An author, sought-after public speaker, Stanton Fellow, wife, mother of 6, Dr. Charity's work reflects a fierce commitment to justice that is personal, generational, and systemic. She is a builder of platforms, disruptor of silence, and unwavering voice for those most often ignored. Dr. Charity holds a doctorate in educational leadership for social justice and a bachelor's in communication studies from Loyola Marymount University and a master's in public administration with an emphasis in management and leadership from Cal State Northridge. She currently serves as the executive director of LA Voice, a multi-faith, multi-racial power-building organization committed to creating a more just, equitable, and compassionate Los Angeles. In this role, she works alongside a movement of faith leaders, community members, and advocates working to dismantle systemic inequity and build thriving communities grounded in dignity and justice. Dr. Charity also serves as the chair of the LA County Commission for Children and Families, where she formerly co-chaired the Commission's inaugural Racial Justice Committee that launched the country's efforts to reform mandated reporting. In this role, she helps guide policy, accountability, and innovation for the largest county in the nation. Her leadership centers the well-being, voice, and liberation of children and families, especially those most impacted by injustice. Friends, I cannot find another speaker that embodies compassion, justice, and belonging. So help me welcome Dr. Charity Chandler-Cole to speak to us this evening.
Okay. How's everyone doing? Good evening. So since y'all can't see this, I'm gonna kick off these heels, okay? We don't need them here. We don't need them here. And before I get started, one of our organizers told me to shout out Jennifer Duran and Rachel Brock. So if you're here, thank you for all you do to support LA Voice. So my lecture today is on Obedience is the Risk, Dr. King, Moral Courage, and the Cost of Faithfulness. And I just want to thank Claremont School of Theology and to everyone gathered here tonight. It is truly an honor to be with you all, to uplift and honor someone who has made an incredible impact in our world and for our country, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I would like to begin this lecture with a labor and land acknowledgement. I want to recognize that we are gathered on lands originally and still cared for by indigenous peoples, including the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Kizh, and Chumash peoples. We honor elders past and present, and we acknowledge the harms of settler colonization, land seizure, broken promises, displacement, and intergenerational trauma. And we acknowledge the labor upon which this nation was built, including the forced labor of enslaved Africans and the labor of indigenous and immigrant communities, including those who have worked under coercion, exploitation, and fear. This acknowledgement is a commitment to truth, repair, and a deeper moral responsibility in how we live and lead. So I want to begin today by saying very clearly what this lecture is and what it's not. This lecture isn't going to be a feel-good story of Dr. King that we're used to hearing. It's not one that's going to make us feel safe and that everything is going to be okay, or encourage us to keep on keeping on and hope and pray for better days ahead. No, not this speech. This lecture isn't also about politics or party preference. It's not about white, black, or brown. This lecture is about moral obedience and the cost of faithfulness. I say that up front because we live in a moment where moral clarity is often mistaken for political extremism, and obedience to conscience is framed as disruption. But what I want to explore tonight is older than our current debates, and it's deeper than policy disagreements. It's the kind of obedience that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lived. Obedience that confronted power, unsettled institutions, and ultimately demanded everything of him. It's the kind of obedience that I've personally leaned into, and it's the kind of obedience that I will be inviting you all to join me in. And when I began writing this, I was kind of wowed by the journey of obedience that God took me on. So we can call this a lecture, a keynote, you may even feel like it's a sermon at some point, but it's a message delivered from a place of obedience, and one that I'm honored to deliver. So I also want to be honest tonight. I'm not standing here as an expert on Dr. King or a scholar in the traditional sense. Like many people, I was introduced to Dr. King through a curriculum that stripped away the danger, the rejection, and the radicalism, and the cost of his obedience. A version that ended the story before it became uncomfortable. Most of us were introduced to a carefully edited version of Dr. King. We learned the safe king, the dreamer, the peacemaker, the man frozen in time at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, offering words that now offend almost no one. That king is quoted once a year. That king is celebrated and sanitized. That king is invoked without being followed. But that version of Dr. King is incomplete. It wasn't until much later that I encountered the fuller king, the one who was surveilled by the government, condemned by the press, abandoned by many allies, and increasingly clear that the price of obedience was rising. Dr. King himself warned us that this would happen. Near the end of his life, he said, "The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around." That's not the language of a man celebrating progress. That is the language of a prophet naming crisis. When I started digging a little deeper into who Dr. King was, there was one thing that consistently stood out about him. It wasn't his brilliance, or that he came from a stable Black family in a violently anti-Black America. It wasn't his confidence, his eloquence, his discipline, his presence, or that he could rock a three-piece suit like no other. What stood out most was this: he was obedient to the calling on his life. Before Dr. King was a symbol of hope and justice, he was obedient. Before he was a figure to be celebrated, he was faithful. He was obedient when he sensed a calling early in life, obedient through school, college, and seminary, obedient when he was called forward by a movement that he did not create, but he could not escape, obedient when his home was bombed and the understandable choice would have been to leave, but he stayed, obedient when his wife and children were threatened, obedient when he traveled to Memphis, ill, exhausted, aware of the danger, and still, he went. Before Dr. King ever had a dream, he lived a nightmare. He experienced firsthand the evilness of racism. He witnessed his community being beaten and bombed, homes and communities set on fire, families torn apart. He witnessed Black men, women, and children spat on, stomped down, degraded, berated, belittled, hosed down, stripped naked, shot to death, gone missing, hung from trees, tarred and feathered. And all because they were Black in America and had the audacity to want to live and thrive and exist in a country that took and stole everything from them. He lived a nightmare. But he dreamed of a future where his 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. I'm sorry, Dr. King, we have not arrived yet. He dreamed that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I'm sorry, Dr. King, we have not arrived yet. How many people here, by show of hands, would say they have a calling over their life, a purpose they feel in their spirit they're supposed to walk in? I know I do. A calling that led you here. We today often romanticize calling as clarity. We think that in order to be obedient to that calling, we have to see and know what the end will look like first. We have to have a plan written down, strategy understood, resources in place, and everything perfect before we obey, before we are all in. Those hands raised that weren't even all in, it was, right? Because when we lift our hands in church, some of us are here and some of us are here. That lets you know if we all in, right? But Scripture tells a different story. When Moses was called on to deliver his people out of Egypt, did he receive a 5-year plan? Did God show his hand? No. Moses received a command to go, and he went, not knowing what would happen, but obeying what he was called to do. Did Noah say, wait, I gotta see this rain before I build a behemoth of an ark? No. He built before the rain, People laughed and called him crazy, but he obeyed. Did Mary say, wait, God, I got to talk this through with Joseph? Or, I need to survey my people to see what their risk tolerance is going to be, and if they will believe me and not stone me because they think I committed adultery and the Messiah? No way, I don't believe it. No. Mary said yes and obeyed without knowing how the story would end. Calling rarely arrives with certainty. Obedience almost always comes first. Dr. King named this reality when he said, faith is taking the first step even when we don't see the whole staircase. He did not know how obedience would end for him. He only knew that silence, retreat, and compromise were not options. As Dr. King's obedience deepened, his analysis sharpened. He began to name what many were unwilling to confront, not just personal prejudice, but what I'll call the architecture of oppression: militarism, economic exploitation, and racism as a structural sin. This is when Dr. King became truly dangerous, not when he dreamed, but when he named systems, not when he inspired, but when he disrupted. In 1967, Dr. King did something that cost him dearly. He publicly confronted the war in Vietnam and the spiritual crisis of a nation that funds violence while humans were starving and in need. He said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. King understood that militarism doesn't just kill overseas, it reshapes what we fund, what we excuse, and who we dehumanize at home. When Dr. King talked about economic exploitation, he was not speaking in abstractions. He was offering a vague critique of poverty. He wasn't offering a vague critique of poverty and inequality. He was naming a deliberate system of extraction, one that took labor, land, and life from Black and poor communities while denying them dignity, stability, and security. King was clear. Poverty was not a personal failure. It was a policy choice. He said, we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you ask that question, you begin to question the economic system itself. This wasn't radical rhetoric. This was a moral diagnosis. King understood that generations of Black Americans were locked into poverty, not because they lacked work ethic, but because the economy was designed to benefit from their labor without rewarding it. He pointed to jobs that paid wages too low to live on, workers laboring full-time and still unable to feed their families, industries built on cheap, disposable Black labor, wealth created by Black hands, but accumulated elsewhere. That is why King supported labor unions. That is why he stood with the sanitation workers in Memphis, men who were literally treated as disposable. That is why he called for guaranteed income. He understood something we still struggle to say plainly today. An economy that requires poverty to function is immoral. And King did not believe charity could solve that. Charity might relieve suffering, but it does not correct theft. And this is where King's thinking became even more threatening, because he didn't just name exploitation, he named debt. In 1963, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, King used language we often quote, but rarely sit with. He said that America had written Black people a promissory note, a promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that promise had come back marked insufficient funds. And y'all know our banks ain't gonna allow us to do that, right? I'm just gonna throw that out there. And it wasn't a metaphor for metaphor's sake. King was saying something very specific. The nation owes a debt. Not charity, not sympathy, not patience, a debt. And debts, morally speaking, require repayment. King rejected the idea that justice could be achieved through slow progress or individual goodwill. He understood that centuries of unpaid labor, stolen land, exclusion from wealth-building systems, and racial terror had produced material harm. And material harm requires material repair. That is why King increasingly spoke about what we now call reparations, even if the word made people then and now uncomfortable. He said, "It's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps." In other words, you cannot demand self-sufficiency from people you've systematically stripped of resources. So when King spoke of the check, he was not asking politely. He was not asking for favors. He was not asking for charity. He was not asking for inclusion without repair. He was making a moral claim. We're coming to get our check. It was not about entitlement. It was about accountability. It was King saying, you cannot exploit labor for centuries. You cannot extract wealth generation after generation. You cannot exclude people from housing, education, and capital, and then demand patience when they ask to be made whole. King understood that reconciliation without repair is hollow. That is why the Poor People's Campaign was not symbolic. It was economic. It was disruptive. It was about redistribution. He was calling for guaranteed income, massive public investment, restructuring economic priorities, a moral reckoning with the wealth accumulation. And this is when many people stopped quoting him. Because talking about dreams is safe, talking about debt is not. Now, let's be honest. We are still living with the consequences of that unpaid check. We see it in racial wealth gaps, housing instability, wage stagnation, debt traps, families working harder and still getting less, communities policed instead of resourced, and we still hear the same moral deflection. Why don't they just work harder? Why can't they be patient? Why are they asking for so much? King answered that decades ago. He taught us that justice delayed is not neutral, it compounds harm. And when he warned that a nation that refused to repair what it has broken will continue to reproduce inequality no matter how many charities it funds. So when King talked about economic exploitation and reparations, he was not being divisive, he was being obedient. He was obeying a moral truth that many still resist. You cannot heal what you refuse to repair. And King became increasingly clear that racism is not just about personal hatred. Racism is embedded in laws, institutions, economic arrangements, cultural narratives, and even sanitized by moral silence. We see that clearly today in our foster care systems, our prisons, how Black and brown people are treated in schools and hospitals, and when accessing public benefits. That is why he called segregation not merely inconvenient, but sinful, a moral wrong upheld by systems. And as his critique expanded, institutional support narrowed. Former allies urged patience. Faith leaders cautioned moderation. People who once celebrated his courage questioned his judgment. Why? Because obedience that exposes structural sin threatens comfort, funding, reputation, and order. One of Dr. King's most enduring and uncomfortable critiques appears in Letter from Birmingham Jail. And what's striking is not who he critiques, but who he doesn't. He does not spend most of his energy condemning open racists. He does not focus primarily on those who hated him openly. Instead, he turns his attention to the so-called moderate, especially religious moderates. He writes, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." That line still stings because it exposes something deeper than disagreement. It exposes a moral posture. Dr. King understood that injustice does not survive on hatred alone. It survives on order. It survives on calm, on delay, on process, on appeals to timing, tone, and the right way. Order for King was not neutral. It was a substitute for obedience. Let me say that again. Order became a substitute for obedience because order feels responsible. Order feels mature. Order feels reasonable. Order sounds like wisdom. But obedience, real obedience, is disruptive. King saw that many in the church were not opposed to justice in theory, They simply wanted it to arrive without disruption, without convenience, without risk. He named that when he wrote about those who say, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods. King recognized this as a moral sleight of hand, because what they were really saying was, justice is acceptable, but not if it unsettles us. Truth is welcome, but not if it costs us something. That is why King said the church had become more concerned with being a thermometer than a thermostat, reflecting the temperature of society rather than transforming it. And here's the part we often miss. King was not accusing the church of cruelty, of course not. He was accusing it of cowardice. Cowardice dressed up as civility. Cowardice disguised as patience. Cowardice baptized in discernment. And the danger of that kind of cowardice is that it allows injustice to continue while everyone involved still feels morally intact. This is why King warned that charity alone was not enough. He said, true compassion is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. In other words, charity can coexist with injustice. Order can coexist with oppression. Silence can coexist with suffering. And when faith communities choose order over obedience, something subtle but devastating happens. They preserve stability, but lose moral authority. They maintain buildings, but abandon their witness. They avoid conflict, but betray the call. King understood that obedience does not ask first, will this cause disruption? It asks, is this faithful? And here is where this becomes deeply personal, especially for those of you preparing for leadership here. Because the pressure to choose order over obedience does not usually arrive as a dramatic moral test. It arrives quietly. Let's not alienate anyone. This isn't the right time. We need to protect the institution. We can't risk our funding. We'll address this later. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, obedience gets postponed, sometimes indefinitely. King saw this pattern clearly, and he warned that delayed justice is not neutral. And he famously wrote, justice too long delayed is justice denied. So when we talk about order over obedience, we are not talking about bad intentions. We are talking about misplaced priorities. We are talking about what happens when institutions value comfort more than courage and predictability more than prophecy. And King's challenge to us is this: will we allow our faith to be governed by fear of disruption or by obedience to truth? So let's be honest about where we are right now. We are witnessing inhumane immigration enforcement, including ICE raids that tear families apart, people disappearing into detention with little transparency or due process, racialized fear used as political strategy, the rollback of DEI efforts under the guise of neutrality, an erosion of democratic norms, the normalization of authoritarian language and tactics, children watching parents taken, communities living in fear, human beings reduced to threats, numbers, or illegals? Let me be clear. Dr. King, if he were here today, would not be neutral about this. He would not have called it complicated. He would not have urged patience. He would have named it for what it is: state-sanctioned violence cloaked in legality. Dr. King taught us that legality and morality are not the same. In Birmingham, segregation was legal. In Nazi Germany, persecution was legal. Legality does not sanctify injustice. King wrote, an unjust law is no law at all. And he warned, y'all can say this one with me, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The question is not whether today's systems are legal, the question is whether they are just. One of the most dangerous lies of faith communities today is the myth of neutrality. Neutrality in the face of cruelty is not neutrality. It is alignment with power. Silence does not protect the vulnerable. It protects the system. Dr. King understood this deeply. He rejected the idea that faith could remain abstract while human beings were being crushed by unjust systems. He knew that obedience will require confrontation and that confrontation might be costly. There comes a moment in every generation, in every life, when the pain of maintaining the status quo becomes greater than the fear of confronting it. That moment will be deeply personal and deeply communal. Today, obedience may cost institutional belonging, professional security, reputation, funding, relationships, maybe even your life. And calling, it does not come with protection. It comes with responsibility. Dr. King understood this with remarkable clarity near the end of his life. In Memphis, the night before he was assassinated, he said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will." That is obedience, not recklessness, not martyrdom seeking, but alignment. Before I name what obedience looks like today, we'll have to tell the truth about what the church is and has been. Because what I'm describing now isn't new. It's not a radical innovation. It's not a departure from our faith tradition. Historically, the church has been one of the most powerful sites of organizing, civic engagement, and moral resistance this country has ever known. Churches were where people gathered to plan boycotts. Churches where freedom schools were born. Churches where voter registration drives were organized. Churches where people learned not just how to pray, but how to resist. Churches where courage was cultivated collectively, not privately. Dr. King did not organize around the church, he organized through it. The Black church in particular was never meant to be only a place of comfort. It was a training ground, a refuge, a political classroom, a moral staging ground. And while some churches still show up that way, thank God for them, many have drifted. Some drifted toward safety, some toward respectability, some toward a theology that separates faith from public life. But here's the truth we must confront. The church did not lose its relevance because it became too political. It lost its relevance because it became too quiet. And that silence did not come from obedience. It came from fear. Now, I want to speak directly again to those of you who are students here, future pastors, theologians, faith leaders. This is the moment when you decide what kind of leaders you will be. Before you inherit pulpits, before you inherit buildings, before you inherit boards, donors, and traditions, you have to decide. Will your congregation be a place where people are soothed, or a place where people are equipped? Or a place where people are formed? Will it be a place where people are told to endure justice, or a place where people are equipped to confront it? Will it be a place of comfort only, or a place of courage? Because once the systems, salaries, and structures are in place, obedience will become harder. So the question is not whether the church can return to its role as a site of organizing and moral leadership. The question is whether we are willing to risk enough to reclaim it. And with that in mind, I want to offer 3 concrete ways obedience can take shape in faith communities today. First, faith communities as civic educators. When I say civic educators, pull out your notes if you have to, because this is some stuff you can go and apply tomorrow. So when I say civic educators, I don't just mean go vote. I mean faith communities must become places where people learn how power works and how to tell the truth about it. Because you cannot obey what you cannot name. And you cannot resist what you do not understand. Policy is not some cold, distant thing out there. Policy is how a child ends up housed or unhoused. Policy is how a mother gets medical care or gets denied. Policy is how a family stays together or gets torn apart. Policy is how a worker is protected or exploited. And if we don't teach people how these systems function, then we leave them spiritually full, but civically powerless. So obedience can look like teaching people how local and county government decisions are made, translating what policies actually mean for real people, hosting Know Your Rights trainings, helping folks understand what a budget funds and what it refuses to fund, offering voter education that is grounded in values and moral clarity, not partisan talking points, because Dr. King reminded us that moral responsibility doesn't stop a personal virtue. It must reach into public life. And I want to ask you directly, when people leave your faith spaces, are they comforted or are they equipped? Do they know how to pray and also how to organize? Do they know how to hope and also how to act? Second, faith communities as sanctuaries for organizing, not just charity. Now hear me carefully, charity is beautiful. My name is Charity, I love charity, you know? Feeding people is sacred, clothing people matters, showing up in crisis matters. But if the church only becomes a place where people can come for handouts and never a place where people build power, then we may be easing suffering while protecting the system that produces it. Charity can become a spiritual sedative. It can make us feel righteous while injustice remains untouched. Dr. King pushed us beyond that. So obedience looks like creating faith spaces where people can safely tell the truth about what they're experiencing. Fear can be named without shame. Strategies can be built collectively. Relationships are formed across lines of race, class, and background. And people can move from, I'm hurting, to, we're organizing. Because sanctuary is not just a place to hide. Sanctuary is a place to regroup, a place to heal, a place to train, a place to build courage. And let me say this plainly, if our churches can mobilize for a holiday program, a building campaign, or an anniversary celebration, we can mobilize to protect families from violence, whether that violence comes from the streets, systems, courts, or cages. So I want to ask, is your faith community a place where people come only to receive, or is it a place where they come to become? And lastly, faith communities as moral advocates in public policy spaces. And this one is big because it's where people start getting a little nervous, you know. But let me remind you, Dr. King did not die because he preached private devotion. He died because he preached public truth. So faith communities must show up where decisions are being made, especially at the local and county level, where policy becomes our lived experience. County decisions determine whether families have housing or support, whether immigration enforcement collaborates with local systems, whether jails and detention centers expand or shrink, if we get mental health funding, if children are supported in schools or they're criminalized, and so forth. So faith communities, if we're absent, those decisions are still going to be made, just without moral scrutiny. So obedience can look like clergy and lay leaders showing up at council meetings, board of supervisor meetings, and public hearings, speaking during public comment, not just as individuals, but a moral collective, and asking questions that others avoid. Who is harmed by this? Who benefits? And who's missing from the table? Because moral courage is not just what we believe, it's where we're willing to stand. And here's the hardest part. Obedience means we stop outsourcing justice. We stop outsourcing it to politicians. We stop outsourcing it to nonprofits. And I'm a nonprofit. You know, we need help. We need our faith leaders. You know, we are here to support faith leaders, not to replace faith leaders. We stop outsourcing it to experts. We stop outsourcing it to the movement as if faith has nothing to do with it. Faith was never meant to be a spectatorship. Faith is participation. So I'll say it again, this is not about partisanship, this is about faithfulness. And Dr. King did not ask whether obedience would cost him, he knew it would. The question he answered was whether he could live with the cost of disobedience. I know I can't. So I'll end this section with a question that I want you to hold in your spirit. If Dr. King were alive today, would he recognize our faith as obedience or as performance? Would he recognize our sanctuaries as sites of courage or sites of comfort? And if obedience is the risk, what risk is your faith demanding of you now? In closing, near the end of his life, Dr. King stood in Memphis and preached what would become known as the mountaintop speech. By then, he knew the danger, he knew the threats, he knew the isolation, and still, he obeyed. That night, he said words that continue to haunt us. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. What is so striking about this moment is not just its prophetic power, it's the acceptance of incompletion. Dr. King understood something deeply spiritual. Obedience does not guarantee that you will see the fruit of your labor. He did not live to see the economic justice he called for, the Poor People's Campaign realized, the dismantling of systems he named, and yet he obeyed. This is where Dr. King's story echoes an even older one. Moses led the people out of bondage. Moses confronted an empire. Moses endured resistance, exhaustion, and betrayal. And Moses never made it to the promised land. Scripture tells us that Moses was allowed to see it, but not to enter it. And yet, we don't call Moses a failure. Why? Because obedience is not measured by arrival, it is measured by faithfulness. Dr. King, like Moses, obeyed without the promise of completion. He trusted that the work was larger than his lifetime, and that obedience itself was the offering. That is a word we desperately need today, because we live in a culture obsessed with outcomes, metrics, and immediate wins. We want to know that our obedience will be rewarded, recognized, and successful. But the question faith asks is different. The question is not, will I win? Will I be affirmed? Will I be protected? The question is, will I obey? Dr. King did not obey because victory was guaranteed. He obeyed because disobedience was not an option. So I want to leave you with a question, not a challenge, but as an invitation. Are you ready to obey? And if so, what does obedience look like for you? Does it look like speaking a truth you have been avoiding? Does it look like disrupting an institution you benefit from? Does it look like risking comfort, reputation, or belonging? Does it look like moving beyond charity into systems change? Does it look like refusing neutrality in the face of cruelty? You may not see the promised land. You may not see the policy change. You may not see the liberation you long for. But if you obey, truly obey, you will have done your part. Dr. King went to the mountaintop. Moses went to the mountaintop. They saw enough to know that it was worth it. The question before us now is not whether we will arrive, but whether we will be faithful on the way. Thank you. All right, let me put my heels back on, y'all. Hold on.
You can stretch for a moment while
I'm just stretching down here, yeah. Picking up a purse. Hold on. Okay. Where do you want? Okay. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Chandler-Cole. I'm Reverend Blair Trigstad-Stowe. I'm the Assistant Dean for Co-Curricular Development here at the Claremont School of Theology, and I'll be moderating our respondents and panel discussion. Our first respondent is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. He's the senior pastor of the Loft LA, a worshiping community here at Westwood United Methodist Church, and serves also as the Associate Professor of Theology, Ecology, and Race at the Methodist Theological School of Ohio. Reverend Dr. Carter's teaching and research focuses on Black and womanist theological ethics, eco-theology, and food and religion. He approaches religious studies as a liberation ethicist committed to exploring how the moral economy of U.S. religious thought and culture impact the everyday lives of marginalized populations. Dr. Carter.
Can we please give Dr. Chandler-Cole another round of applause for an excellent talk? I really enjoyed it. I have my notes that I already had, and then I add a couple things based on what you said, and then I have some things I want us to discuss when we have our conversation. And as everyone that has heard me speak before, I'm sure I have too much to say, so I'm going to try to not talk too fast and save some for later. I think one of the challenges that comes up for me when we are thinking about obedience is authority and who we are being obedient to. What we are witnessing now is this worship of obedience to particular folk, people, ideas, ways of being in the world that are requiring submission to authority, and these authorities are clearly doing harm, doing injustice, and hurting people, murdering people. People are dying. And I think one of the challenge of discernment that I think people of faith, but also people of good conscience have to have is how and in what ways do we discern how we might practice our obedience and who we are being obedient to. For Christians, this comes down to, I think, developing a robust, nuanced, a healthy understanding of sin. And it was interesting for me, having not grown up in a community. I didn't grow up in a fire and brimstone community. I didn't grow up in a community that talked a lot about sin in that way. I think I kind of inherited a social understanding of sin and what it meant to be in solidarity with folk growing up as a child. But having worked at a Catholic institution for many years, they like to talk a lot about sin, a lot about guilt. And so I think I internalized that, and I learned how to speak about it. But what struck me is, in refining this, how uncomfortable many mainline Protestant churches, and particularly progressive churches, are uncomfortable with talking about sin. And what is sin? What it means to be sinful. Now, indeed, I know some of this is a part of our religious trauma, particularly those of us who come from harmful conservative theologies that weaponize sin. But what we have to understand here is what I think King was critiquing, and what we are witnessing is a misunderstanding of sin that is allowing and enabling the injustice we are witnessing on our streets today being perpetrated by a military force that we can call ICE. And there's this book by Andrew Crinks that I have been reading multiple times and thinking about a lot lately because it seems so relevant right now. Andrew finished his PhD at Vanderbilt University, worked with Emily Towns, who's one of the speakers who we had here. The name of his book is White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization. And I think what he did for me is kind of help me draw some, or connect the dots in some spaces that I think I struggle with that I think will help tie in some things tonight. What he writes in the book, he says, while understandings of what precisely sin and salvation entail vary across Christian thought, a predominant trajectory within Christian theology interprets sin and salvation in terms of human obedience and subjection to divine authority that properly reflects a radical difference in power and ontology between humans and God. In this way, sin is understood as a disobedient refusal to be subject to a benevolent, life-giving authority, while salvation is understood to entail obedience and to return, obedient return to subjection to that authority. And so the challenge we have is we have folks out here that are interpreting, resisting abuse as sin, resisting arrest as sin, resisting being accosted by someone on the street demanding to see your ID as sin, resisting someone with a mask coming up and trying to tear gas you as sin, resisting they are portraying as sin, when what we see and what King showed us and what we see in the Bible is the importance of faithful resistance. And so the question, I think, that undergirds so much of this conversation around authority is, to whom are we giving authority? To whom are we giving authority? And this is the question I think King forced the church, and at this time in his life, the segregated church, the black church and the white church, to wrestle with. But it is a question that all churches must indeed wrestle with, because quite honestly, we have been living with the convenient fiction that we progressives are on the right side of history. And I call this a convenient fiction because this is a feel-good theology that requires little sacrifice. It requires pious platitudes, but it doesn't actually come with a cost, as we learned so much about tonight. The convenient fiction we have is that we can be progressive on one justice issue, but more moderate on another. And as I teach my students in their introduction to Christian ethics classes, ethical norms are on a bus and not an Uber. And so what this means is that if you have an ethical norm about what justice is, it's going to take you from A to B to C like you're on a bus line. You can't make a bus is not an Uber. You can't make it go one direction and then maybe on Tuesday I'm gonna have the bus line go this way. No, the bus goes where it goes. And so if you have a commitment to justice, you have to apply that on all these particular issues. The convenient fiction that we have is that we want to apply our commitments on issues that we like, but not the ones that critique the way we are being in the world or what we are not doing in the world. With this kind of broken theology, with fractured ethical norms, salvation becomes understood as obedience and subjection to a God. But this God is the reflection of the human being that is in charge. This God is a reflection of the authority figure, which is almost 98% of the time is a man. 99% of the time, and then 1% is probably Christy gnome, right? So most of the time, this is a man. And this is because it revolves around so much masculine insecurity, where these men have to be hyper-masculine to see themselves as God, to feel as though they actually matter, because they are struggling with their own insecurity. But that is not what salvation is, and that's not the salvation King talks about. That's not the salvation that Jesus discusses. King, quoting Jesus, offers a more accurate picture of what salvation looks like in his sermon, Guidelines for a Constructive Church. King quotes Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth after he comes out of the wilderness, where he says in Luke 4, I'm sure you all know this, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus was not coming to be someone who bent for empire. Rather, Jesus came to abolish the conditions that created human suffering in the first place. Salvation inherently requires abolition to the conditions that create suffering in the first place. King understood this. This is why he was lynched, because he understood what salvation actually cost. He followed the path of Jesus. True salvation recognizes there is a cost to discipleship. Or I love what you called it, Dr. Chandler-Cole, that there is a risk tolerance that may make some of us uncomfortable when you're talking about actual salvation on this side of the ground, because it requires an introspection where we have to risk our ability or recognize that we might be wrong. We have to be self-reflective and understand that we have to hold ourselves accountable to grow towards a deeper understanding of what justice looks like, because the conditions of injustice are always changing, trying to lure us to follow along that path. Accountability is what we don't see in our current political structures. Accountability is what we don't see in so many churches. And it is accountability that we need to actually make sure we are doing the work that is in alignment with our call. So when King says in his sermon, I've been to the mountain, or in the sermon that was quoted earlier, where he says, I've been to the mountaintop, right? He says, like any human being, I've lived a long life. But for him to be accountable to his moral commitments, he knew that he might not get to see the other side, that he might not get to the promised land with everybody. That is a truth that more than any time in my short life on this earth, I have had to accept, because I have made the decision to be honest when I speak in front of people, and that has a cost. And if you are in this space, you have to make a decision as to, are you going to be honest about what you are seeing, or you're going to fall victim to the lying eyes that they're telling you that what you're seeing actually doesn't exist when you're watching things on TikTok or when you see things on the news. There is a cost. I will close by quoting Reverend Robert Hirschfield. He's the Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire. And he was giving a vigil around the shooting of Renee Nicole Good. And he said to his clergymen, he said, I've asked them to get their affairs in order, to make sure that they have their wills written, because it may be that now is no longer the time for statements, but for us, with our bodies, to stand between the powers of this world and the most vulnerable. I don't know what else you need to see to understand that this is what is required now. This is what is required now, to put your body, your voice, your job, your money on the line. Because if you don't, we again have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of disobedience? I know the cost of disobedience. I can listen to my grandfather and hear the cost of disobedience in his voice. Someone who grew up with Jim Crow slavery. We have to recognize that we can go backwards towards that so quickly. So are we going to take seriously the cost of disobedience as much as weighing the cost of obedience? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. Our second respondent is Dr. Minwan Song. Dr. Song serves as the associate pastor at Wilshire United Methodist Church and as assistant professor in the practice of ministry here at CST. Dr. Song's research explores the intersection of mental distress, faith, and social justice, particularly how religion and spirituality can support recovery, empowerment, and liberation for individuals with diverse lived experiences of mental distress. Dr. Song.
Good evening. First of all, thank you, Dr. Chandler-Cole, for your insightful and fabulous lecture tonight. Today's panel felt especially relevant and resonant in light of current upheavals across local, domestic, and international context. Approaching Dr. King's legacy through the lens of moral obedience, for me, offers a compelling framework for interpreting this dire moment marked by sufferings and crises that jeopardized the well-being of many people. In his book, Dr. King, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Dr. King reflects on the period following historic advances in the civil rights movement, a time when those gains were increasingly met with resistance and backlash. He names a tension that remains deeply familiar in our contemporary context. Here I quote, "The great majority of Americans are suspended between these opposing attitudes. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it." Within this context, Dr. King observes how public sentiment can easily shift when demands for justice persist. Here I quote again, "Black people's demand that yesterday evoked admiration and support today, to many, have become tiresome, unwarranted, and a disturbance to the enjoyment of life. Dr. King's diagnosis captures a painful turning point when moral commitment to social justice and liberation, once celebrated, come to be perceived as disruptive rather than necessary once they begin to unsettle people's comfort or their self-interest. We see this dynamic unfold repeatedly. In moments of political or economic upheaval, commitment to justice are often sidelined, justified by the claim that the work has already been sufficient, or that other crises are more urgent and warrants greater urgency. As Dr. Chandler-Cole elaborates, Dr. King's obedience to his sacred calling enabled him to endure profound internal and external struggles rather than retreat into a state of spiritual avoidance. In his sermon titled Guidelines for a Constructive Church, Dr. King described the church as a place that offers hope, not by encouraging people to escape the facts and realities of life, such as disappointment, failure, and grief, but by inviting them through the power of God to take up these burdens faithfully in order for church to address the social injustice, serve the poor and the marginalized, and proclaim liberation to the world. I believe this is what Dr. Chandler-Cole named as obedient, Dr. King's obedience, when it becomes central to the church's vocation and witness. Beyond the socio-political climate of the United States, we are also witnessing similar patterns unfolding across the globe. Retreat from justice-oriented commitment, such as for world peace, human rights, responses to the crisis of democracy, or to the environmental crisis are increasingly evident. Painfully, many within the church itself, and including the immigrant church community here in the US, assume the posture of bystanders in the face of suffering, exclusion, and structural harm inflicted upon vulnerable populations. Therefore, in this light, I believe the transformative power of moral obedience, as witnessed in Dr. King's life and legacy, offer the church a way forward. It reminds us that spiritual formation, both personal and communal, is inseparable from the spiritual responsibility to care proactively for our neighbor and for the world we share. And as Dr. Chandler-Cole mentioned during her lecture, this is not a new insight or idea. However, I believe the lecture powerfully calls us to recognize once again the practices and aims of spiritual formation within the church must be critically re-engaged in light of ongoing systemic and structural injustices that continue to harm and exacerbate human lives. Spiritual formation needs to be reshaped and deepened through the church's role in helping people form a holistic commitment, which includes both spiritual and moral dimensions, that bears the cost of refusing to remain mere bystanders, and instead becoming active participants in responding to the suffering of our neighbor. Thank you.
On? Is it on now? Perfect. Thank you all for your thoughts, your reflections, and your words in this space. I'm struck by a thread through all of the three responses or our presentation and our responses this evening of questions about risk tolerance. How do we build our risk tolerance so that we can choose to be obedient in a discerning way and not reactionary in a bombastic way? Because having served many congregations full of well-meaning white progressives, sometimes the anxiety switch from maybe I should pay attention to I have to do something is very fast, and the response can be less than helpful. So knowing you all come from different perspectives of community organizing, formation, ethics, how can we instruct people in building both risk tolerance to move forward, but also obedient discernment rather than reaction?
I was trying not to go first. This whole ladies first thing doesn't work. It's going to be different for everyone. I don't want to pretend that I have the answer for that. For me, it was very personal. It was very spiritual. It was a journey that I went on of acceptance of what was. So once I accepted that God called me to something, and I still can't even definitively tell you what that calling is. Like, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, because I don't want to be anything. I just want to be used by God. And so it's acceptance that this is the life I was called to lead, and I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I'm ready for whatever. When I was in the interview process for the job with LA Voice, they wanted everyone to bring a picture that stated their why, and everyone brought pictures of like their kids, and as I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's my why? In the beginning, it was my kids, it was this spirit of defiance to prove everyone wrong and show I could be, the girl from South Central that was, selling drugs at 14 in a gang and doing all the things in and out of juvie, that I could be somebody. But then it turned to obedience was my why. Because if my kids were to disappear, something tragic were to happen and they were to disappear today, I would still walk in my purpose because I've accepted it. And yes, my will and trust is done. So I have that peace of mind knowing that my kids are going to be good if something were to happen to me. But for me, it was just very spiritual, and I don't react. I'm teaching my staff now to not react to everything and feeling the need to respond, react to everything and respond to everything, and to find stillness. So I get clarity from being still and listening to God and feeling that conviction in my soul that tells me, move now. But once I've accepted the calling on my life, I let go of this feeling of having to control what it looks like, of having to overplan for what it looks like, and accepting the fact that God's going to give me the resources and support and knowledge and wisdom and courage to show up however I need to show up.
No, I loved the way you phrased. I like the language of risk tolerance because it's obviously the kind of language that people are accustomed to in like the more corporate spaces. But I also think, it does play on so much about the risk of faith and the cost of discipleship and all these kind of phrases that you find within the field of theology and ethics. And so, for me, I think I want to go to the question you asked about the cost of disobedience. I just think that's such a helpful reframe. That's such a helpful reframe. And I think that people, for me, confronting the cost of disobedience helps me increase my risk tolerance. Because I've been to enough places and I've traveled enough to see what we can lose. And I also know that, I tell my students, I've been black all my life. We just got just a tiny, teensy, weensy bit of some rights. In the history of America, 450 years, you're talking about we've had technically equal civil rights for 70 out of 500 years, roughly. I'm doing the math now in my head. That's nothing. That's nothing. And I know those can be taken away. And so understanding the cost of disobedience, what will happen if I don't take these risks to preserve what we have, but also to continue to fight for equity, justice, and love through the lens of radical compassion, I think for me is key. But I agree that it looks different for different people. Because I want to say where I know I struggle with that now is I have a son that has learning disabilities. I have a disabled son that requires me to navigate the kinds of risks I will take now versus what I would take before I had a kid. And so I'm always weighing on myself, feeling as though I should do more, knowing that I can't always. And so that's one area. But at the same time, I also understand, and I said this to Blair frequently, like, I understand as best as I can, I'm inviting white people in my congregation, in all these spaces, when you give up, I'm inviting you to give up proximity to whiteness. And I don't know that people fully understand what that looks like. Like if you look at the Freedom Riders, like if you don't know, send me an email and I send you some documentaries to watch. Like there is a cost to give this up because it's all transactional. Whiteness is a fiction, and when you start actually supporting justice issues that resist patriarchy and racism, man, they will snatch it away, right? And that is hard, and it's so alluring. It's so alluring. And so I think trying to recognize what will cost if we don't do it is what motivates me, because I think I live with that awareness of not having it. So.
I'm having a benefit of serving the immigrant church. One thing I observed in my service is immigrant church, especially Korean immigrant church, have long been hid behind the myth of the model minority narratives. And then I see that this narrative so much developed into a very speculative theological narrative, and then that got the social mobility, and then higher ranks in the society. But in truth, I've seen that the promises of myths have been ultimately false. And then that crashes the immigrant churches now dwindled and withered. So out of many tasks, I would like for them to, liberated, genuinely liberated and empowered. To be empowered, I want to wrestle and tackle that model minority myth narrative inside the church.
Thank you, Dr. Song. I'm wondering, too, you started to take us towards the practical, Dr. Chandler-Cole, which I appreciate. I'm a practical theologian. I like to know what I can do, right? I'm curious, in your experiences, where have you started to see the church succeed in fulfilling this call from Dr. King of being civic organizers, of stepping into obedience, whether it was small or big, especially at the local level? I think right now many of us feel overwhelmed, or perhaps I should not speak for others, but I know at moments I feel overwhelmed that the problems seem up here. So I'm not a billionaire. How do I affect up here? But there are many, many things we can do right around us. And so I'm curious, where have you seen that hope?
I can go first. You want me to? Do you want me to go first? Okay. All right. For me, I don't want to talk about what we do here, although I will say I do think we are as good, Methodists, we are striving towards doing good work in my own church community. But I remain active in supporting groups that are on the ground in Minneapolis right now, church communities that I think that has given me so much heart by seeing the way churches have become disruptors, how clergy have become disruptors, how people are actually pushing back the misuse and abuse of Scripture by Homeland Security, like, to them. Like, it has given me a kind of hope. I'll be honest, like, I don't have a lot of hope in, I don't know it's getting recorded, but it is what it is. I don't have a lot of, I don't have as much hope for white Christians to do the thing that they actually need to do. That's my gut, because of the cost. But Minneapolis is chock full of white people. And I'm like, some of them folks out there, I'm like, they out there doing it. And what you see happening, so I have a couple of good friends who live there. I know we have a mutual clergy friend who's around there. And what you see is there is genuine community there, and they feel as though they are all under threat. And rather than dispersing, it's created this way of solidarity that I am proud for what I see my clergy colleagues across the religious spectrum in doing in that space. And while I can't name specifics because this is being recorded and I don't want to do that, I can say there are people who are, it is a very tactical, strategic. It is so close to what we saw Jim talk about doing in Nashville, right? It has made me very proud. And so that's, for me, what I've been able to see people actually begin to do it. And it took violence, I think, to bring it out, but it has come out.
Yeah, I would say starting at LA Voice, it has been so refreshing to see so many congregations across faiths that are organizing, that are stepping up, that are naming and calling out racism and are bringing their congregations along. LA Voice helps support congregations by helping them build people power, training them. I think a lot of congregations, there may be some who are like, okay, I'm ready, but where do I start? What does it look like? So being able to understand who your peers are and who are those that can help train, help you organize, help you lead, in a way where we go back to the roots of, of all of this work starting in congregations. It didn't start in the streets. It didn't start in, folks' homes. It started in churches, So it's been refreshing to see that. We need to make sure we're out there modeling it. One of the things about what's happening in Minneapolis is we're seeing on the news, bishops and clergy, at the podiums, speaking out, resisting and disrupting. And it's great to see because, yes, we're practicing nonviolence, but that doesn't mean we're silent. That doesn't mean we're going to tolerate. That just means we're not going to hit you. And I'm from South Central, so I'm still struggling with that. I'm like, well, what if they do this? Can we do this? So I'm still working through that part. But you can be nonviolent and still use our bodies. Even when you mentioned what the bishop said, we may have to use our bodies as clergy, even if it's just locking arms and creating a human shield. What would that cost? We're not, so just being intentional and being prepared, mentally prepared for whatever may come. And we need to invite others. We can't be so righteous that we're like, well, our congregation has it together. We ready, but we're not helping others get ready. So we are seeing folks, I think, unfortunately, it took nonsense like what's happening in our world to really ignite the flame for people to show up and step up and say, I'm ready, and then being able to look to their left and right and say, okay, I know where to go for training. I know where to go for development. I know who my people are, so that you're not alone, that we're showing up as a force, but it's happening. It's beautiful to see, but there's not enough of us either, so.
I think one of the things about Minneapolis as well is this is the second round in 5 years of major organizing and responding. And so I'm hearing from clergy colleagues that as soon as ICE arrived in town, they already knew each other from having been organized to respond to the murder of George Floyd. And so there's a power in networks beyond the people you sitting in the pew next to. And that because Minneapolis already had these networks of response, it's one of the reasons they've been so well organized to resist particularly well. Dr. Song, what do you want to share?
I personally find the hope
in the prophetic voice like Dr. Chandler-Cole lectured today. Well, ever since all the upheavals globally and then also locally happened, I feel like I lived in a two divided world. Like places like CST, or when I meet progressive, my clergy mates, I mean, all their works, I get encouraged a lot. And then I still find hope in there. Coming back to where I serve, that silence that really discouraged and demoralized me. And then I'm not talking bad at all about the immigrant church. Immigrant church has been a civic place and a shelter for many, many individuals who lack the resources, who don't have any assistance. And then it has been a spiritual place for people, places like a village that support them. But that silence inside the church really disappointed me. As someone who was supposed to be challenge them, encourage them to speak up, raise their voice, but it seems like it's not possible to do that in that environment. But again, I see the young people who get scolded by the older folks in the church not to bring up the political issues. And then, well, immigrant churches chose to depoliticize the faith discourse. It's part of their survival strategy. But again, just like modern minority myth, it doesn't serve them at all. So, well, I just wanted to share my dilemma as a clergy, but also scholar.
Thank you. We are at time, unfortunately, so we do not have time for group Q&A, but I'll invite us all into as an educator, into a moment of building our risk tolerance before we leave. I'd encourage you to meet someone new in this space, to introduce yourself and perhaps share why you came tonight and one thing you're taking away. And that is a base level of risk tolerance, is simply meeting people you don't know yet. That's the beginning of organizing. So I'd invite you all into that practice this evening. Thank you all. Thank you to our keynote speaker, to our respondents. I appreciate you bringing your experience and your voices into this space. And our closing this evening will come from Dr. Lincoln Galloway. You want to use the pulpit?
Well, it's been a wonderful evening and a great joy to all of us who have been looking forward to this day, to see you here tonight and to know that after the years of isolation due to COVID, we are able to gather in person for the first time here at Westwood. On behalf of the Pan-African Seminarians Association, and on behalf of my colleague, Professor Nicholas Greer, who serves as one of the faculty advisors to the Pan-African Seminaries Association, it is my great pleasure to offer words of gratitude to all those persons who have given so much to make our MLK celebrations such a success. First, of course, I want to offer thanks to Dr. Charity Chandler-Cole for graciously accepting our invitation to be our featured speaker this year. I think some of you have figured this out, but it was only a matter, I think we can count in days, a few days, that we've had to ask her to step in and be our featured speaker tonight. So from the bottom of my heart, I'm so grateful. You can't imagine what it feels like a few days before this event to have a response from someone who says, I enthusiastically accept your invitation to step in and to be our featured address tonight. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for meeting with our students this morning for a conversation, and for this evening engaging us in a very profound and challenging interrogation of obedience, obedience as disruption, of moral courage, of an affirmation of the risks and the costs. Thanks, Dr. Chandler-Cole, for an excellent, inspiring, and what will certainly be a very memorable presentation. Thank you so much. Thanks to one of CST's outstanding students, the Reverend Royce Porter, for highlighting the occasion. I think with every sentence I wanted to say amen. Preach it, brother. And he did not disappoint. Thanks also to two respondents. First, Reverend Dr. Chris Carter, who is one of the pastors here at Westwood, and again, with great pride, we announce that you are an outstanding alumnus of Claremont School of Theology's Master of Divinity program, and also our PhD program. Second, thank you to Reverend Dr. Minun Song, who currently serves as Assistant Professor of the Practice of Ministry at CST. His research explores the intersection of mental distress, faith, and social justice. Thank you both for engaging tonight's lecture with your own insights, your own wisdom, your own questions, and your probing to expand our knowledge and our imagination. And I also want finally to offer thanks to all who shared their gifts in our MLK celebrations. Thank you to our doctoral student, Reverend Oyodele Ode, for your gifts, your willingness to take on the mantle of leadership of the Pan-African Student Association, PASA, and also your work with the Student Council and the Committee on Community Life. Thanks to our co-presidents, Bishop Grant Agia, Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Kwan. Thanks to all in the President's Office, especially to Steve Horswell Johnson, Senior Vice President for Advancement and Communications, to Max Weddle, our Director of Admissions and Communications, to Angela, to Dimitri, to Monica, and all the others on the Planning Committee. Thanks to all in the Dean's Office, with very, very special thanks going to Reverend Blair Stowe. Very special thanks. Blair, as you know, is our Dean for Co-Curricular Development, and she is working tirelessly to build relationships with all who are in our new neighborhood here at Westwood and the greater Los Angeles area, and all the organizations that you represent. So please give her a call. Let her know that you're willing to be in relationship with her and with CST. Finally, special heartfelt thanks to our Director of Educational Information and Worship Technologies, Reverend Clint Collins, who worked on the technology side of tonight's event. Clint, we are grateful to you, not only for tonight, but beginning in the years of COVID, you worked your magic as the tech guru and mastermind working behind the scenes to ensure the success of our MLK celebrations. Thanks, Clint. To all of you who have gathered here this evening, I say on behalf of my colleague Nicholas Greer, and behalf of PASA, all of the student organizations, the entire CST community, we appreciate your presence. We thank you for being here and choosing to join the conversation. We thank you for your participation in our 47th annual MLK celebrations. And of course, please try and put this on your calendar for next year. We look forward to seeing you again next year, when we will surely be doing a few more activities in person. And you don't want to miss that. So thank you, and have a good night.